Greetings everyone, I'm Detective STARBORN, and I'm glad to see you on my YouTube channel. Please be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on new and interesting videos. Thank you, and enjoy watching. A girl came home from school and was alone for just a few minutes, but when her parents returned home, she was nowhere to be found. Police volunteers searched for her for several weeks, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. At one point, however, there was an unexpected turn in the case that led to a chain of consequences that shocked the entire country. Eventually, this case became one of the most high-profile and scandalous in Canadian history, and remains so to this day. Christine Jessop was born on November 29, 1974, in the small Canadian town of Queensville. It was a quiet and peaceful place located near a picturesque lake. With a population of only about 600 people, Queensville was considered a very safe community, and many of its residents knew each other. Christine lived there with her parents and brother, who was 5 years older than her. She loved spending time outside with friends, riding her bicycle, and playing baseball, which she grew to love thanks to her brother. Besides this, the girl really loved animals. Once a bat flew into her room, and Christine, unlike all her relatives, not only wasn't scared, but wanted to keep it as a pet in their house. On October 3, 1984, when Christine was 9, she woke up early in the morning as usual and started preparing for school. Her brother had a toothache, so their mom was planning to take him to the dentist. Because of this, after school, the girl was supposed to stay home alone until their return. Despite her age, it wasn't the first time Christine had been left unsupervised, and her parents weren't worried that something might happen to her. The girl was very independent and could take care of herself. Before leaving school, Christine arranged to meet her best friend after they both went home. Then the girl got on the school bus, which dropped her off several hundred meters from home. At the appointed time, Christine's friend came to the park where they had agreed to meet and started waiting for her. However, time passed and Christine never showed up. The girl waited a bit longer, then went home and tried to call her friend, but no one answered. Meanwhile, Christine's mom and brother returned home. The woman immediately discovered that her daughter wasn't there, though it was clear that the girl had come home after school. Her backpack was in her room, and the mail from the mailbox was in the hallway. However, the mother noticed several strange things. First, Christine's bicycle was lying in front of the house, and its kickstand was bent. The girl loved this bicycle and always used it very carefully, so the woman was surprised that her daughter could have just left it on the street. Second, Christine's jacket was hanging in the hallway on the top hook, which the girl clearly couldn't have reached by herself. But despite this, at first, the woman didn't see any reason for concern. The mother thought that Christine had just gone out to play, as she had done many times before, and waited for her. After about an hour, when it was already getting dark outside, the woman started to worry. Although Christine was independent and spent a lot of time outside, she always came home and let them know where she planned to go. The mother began calling the parents of all her friends, hoping that Christine was playing with one of them. But each time she received the answer that no one had seen her after school. When the mother called her best friend, she told her that she and Christine had planned to meet in the park, but the girl never showed up. Realizing that none of her friends had seen her daughter, the woman went out searching with her son. Given the small size of the town, they quickly checked all the places where Christine liked to spend time, but the girl was nowhere to be found. She hadn't returned home either, and around 7 o'clock in the evening, the mother decided to contact the police. For the local police department, cases of this kind weren't rare, but in the vast majority of cases, they dealt with children who either simply lost track of time while playing or were upset with their parents and decided to run away from home. In all these cases, they managed to find them in the shortest possible time without conducting any investigation. This time, they also organized a search, asking for help from the town's residents, who immediately responded and went out to look for the girl. In addition, the police established that Christine had gone into a small store located between her house and the park, where she was supposed to meet her friend. The girl bought gum, but where she went afterward remained a mystery. There were no surveillance cameras in those years, so the officers couldn't even establish exact time frames. In their opinion, the girl had gone to the store just a few minutes after returning home from school. The search continued until late at night, but they still couldn't find Christine. The next day, even more people came out to the streets to look for her. Various leads started coming into the police. However, none of them proved useful. Most people said they had seen some girl on the street or in a passing car, but none of them were sure it was Christine, and they couldn't remember any additional details. Over the next few days, the police began to lean toward the possibility that they might be dealing with a kidnapping. There was practically no chance that Christine could have remained unnoticed when every resident of the town knew about her disappearance. The girl's mother also insisted that her daughter would never run away from home. But despite all this, the police still couldn't find a single clue that would bring them closer to finding the girl. They examined her house, however, due to lack of experience, they did this extremely unprofessionally. The police superficially examined some of the girl's belongings without taking fingerprints. They also allowed dozens of neighbors and family friends to enter Christine's family home before the examination, so even if there had been any evidence, it was all compromised. It's worth noting that at the time of the girl's disappearance, her father was in prison. Just a few weeks before this, he had received a short sentence for minor fraud, and on the day Christine disappeared, her mom and brother had gone to visit him after the dentist appointment. When it became clear that the girl had most likely been kidnapped, the man was released from prison so he could be with his family, and the father immediately joined the search for his daughter. The search continued for several weeks, but time after time, they failed to find either Christine herself or any evidence that could shed light on her disappearance. The search area gradually expanded, covering the numerous fields and forests surrounding the town, but this yielded no results. This continued for 3 months, until December 31st. While everyone was preparing to celebrate New Year's Eve, Christine's family was in no mood for celebrations. They continued to hope that the girl would still be found alive, but they almost didn't believe it was possible anymore. On that day, a man from a town called Sunderland, located 35 miles from Queensville, went out to look for his runaway dog. Walking through a deserted wooded area behind his house, he noticed something that looked like a small pile of garbage and approached closer. To his horror, he discovered a human body there and immediately returned home to call the police. As soon as officers approached the site, they quickly established the identity of the deceased, even despite the severe state of decomposition. Next to the body lay a small tape recorder with a piece of paper stuck to it, bearing the name Christine Jessop. This tape recorder had been issued to the girl at school on the very day she disappeared. Additionally, officers immediately suspected that the victim had been assaulted. Some of her clothing, including pants and underwear, was lying next to the body, while her upper clothing remained on her. The body was sent to medical examiners, and the police from Queensville reclassified the case as a murder. Multiple blunt force wounds were found on Christine's body, which were determined to be the cause of death, along with a small number of abrasions. Experts confirmed that the victim had indeed been assaulted, with foreign biological material found on her underwear. However, at that time, DNA analysis wasn't yet in use, so this evidence couldn't help identify the perpetrator. According to investigators, the victim was killed somewhere else, after which the perpetrator transported her to the location where the body would later be found. However, they found it strange that the killer drove almost 40 miles and left the body near another town, since there were endless fields and forests around Queensville. They speculated that the perpetrator might have some connection to Sunderland and chose this location because he was very familiar with it. At the same time, they were almost certain that the perpetrator lived in Queensville and knew Christine, as everything indicated that the girl might have gone with him or gotten into his car voluntarily. Investigators repeatedly asked the victim's parents if they had anyone in mind whom they considered a possible suspect. However, Christine's mom kept saying that she couldn't think of anyone who seemed suspicious to her. The police interviewed practically all the town's residents and considered several people who either had a criminal history or were mentioned in numerous tips, but they couldn't connect any of them to this crime. This continued until February 14th, when detectives came to speak with the victim's mother again. They once more asked her to think if she had anyone in mind who seemed suspicious to her. And this time, the woman remembered something strange. The Morin's family lived next door to them, and they were well respected in their town. The head of the family owned a small business and was known for being able to fix almost anything. For this reason, Queensville residents often turned to him for help, and he had a good reputation. The man had 6 adult children who helped him in his business. One of them, 25-year-old Paul Morin, lived with his parents, and Christine's mom remembered several strange things. First, after her daughter's disappearance, Paul never once participated in the search, although almost all town residents had joined the effort over several weeks. Secondly, after the body was discovered, Paul didn't attend her funeral, where hundreds of people were present. The woman added that Paul was quite quiet and withdrawn. He had a few friends and a girlfriend, but unlike the rest of his relatives, the man kept his distance from other people. Besides this, he was passionate about playing the clarinet. This fact seemed interesting to the detectives since Christine had a tape recorder with her at the time of her kidnapping. They speculated that Paul might have used the topic of music to start a conversation with the girl and invite her to come with him. In addition to this, Christine must have known him since he had lived just meters from their house his entire life. Detectives went to talk to him and asked how well he knew the victim. Paul stated that they had barely ever communicated, except for one instance when the girl's dog ran away, and he helped her catch it. When asked about his whereabouts that day, Paul answered that he had been at work 650 miles from the town until about 3:30, after which he went to the store for groceries, stopped at a gas station, and returned home around 5 o'clock in the evening. Lastly, the detectives asked what he thought about Christine. Paul replied that she was an ordinary sweet child, but then added a rather strange phrase, saying that sometimes they grow up to be spoiled. The police found this very suspicious and began checking his alibi. After obtaining the time card from the factory where Paul worked, they saw that he had finished his shift exactly at 3:32 that day. Thus, even if he had driven straight to Christine's house, he simply wouldn't have had time to get there before her mother's return. And further verification confirmed that the man had stopped at the store and gas station, which took about half an hour in total. Then Paul's relatives confirmed that he had arrived home around 5 o'clock and almost immediately went to bed because he was tired from work. Based on all this, he simply wouldn't have had enough time to kidnap Christine, but investigators suspected that his relatives might either be confused about the timing of his return or be deliberately covering for Paul. Detectives asked permission to examine the car the man drove and found several fabric fibers in the trunk, which were sent to experts. They determined that these fibers matched the fabric of the victim's sweater that she was wearing on the day of her disappearance. Additionally, several hairs were found on the victim's body, and experts stated that they could belong to Paul, although there was no 100% confirmation of this. In those years, specialists could only visually compare several hair samples and suggest that they were similar or see obvious differences, such as in color. Finally, the police turned to an FBI profiler who created an approximate profile of the killer after studying all available data about this crime. In his opinion, it was a man from Queensville between 19 and 26 years old, and he had prior convictions for crimes like arson and voyeurism. The profiler provided other characteristics as well, but the detectives focused only on those that matched Paul's description. The man had no criminal history or any bad reputation, so he matched less than half of the points provided by the profiler. Despite this, the police were convinced that Paul was the killer, and on April 22nd, they decided to arrest him. The man denied any involvement in the crime, and he was placed in jail awaiting the start of the trial. Christine's parents were shocked that this crime could have been committed by their nearest neighbor. Nevertheless, the main problem for the detectives was precisely the words of the victim's mother, who had given them the exact time of her return home, 4:10. She was certain about this because she had looked at the clock right as she walked into the kitchen. According to investigators' calculations, Paul couldn't have managed to drive from his workplace to their house before 4:10, and he would have needed at least 15 to 20 more minutes. So they continued asking the woman if she was really sure about the time, or if she might be mistaken. They also insisted that Paul was the killer, but her testimony about the time made it impossible to prosecute him. Eventually, the woman conceded that she might have indeed arrived a bit later, and this was enough for the police. At the trial, the prosecution tried to present Paul as a strange loner whose behavior raised concerns among other town residents. They also claimed that the man would have had enough time to kidnap the victim since her mom had arrived home later than she had previously stated. As for the testimony of Paul's relatives who confirmed his alibi, a psychologist invited by the prosecutor stated that the entire family showed signs of covering for Paul. One of the main moments at the trial was the testimony of an undercover police officer who had been placed in Paul's jail cell while he was awaiting trial. According to his account, the man had mentioned exact details about this crime, such as the cause of the victim's death. However, this information had been in the newspapers, so he hadn't said anything new. Additionally, Paul told him that his favorite movie was The Shining and would answer his cellmate's questions with quotes from the film. While Paul told him he was innocent, the undercover officer's testimony had a serious impact on the trial. Along with all the prosecutor's other attempts to portray Paul as an obviously strange and dangerous person, this only added to the negative image of the man. But despite this, the main factor remained the questionable evidence from the prosecution, and ultimately, the jury did not find it sufficient for a conviction. In the end, Paul was found not guilty and was released from the courtroom. The prosecution immediately said they would appeal, and they remained convinced of his involvement. Christine's family was shocked once again. They would have to live just meters away from the man who had been accused of killing their daughter. The girl's father added that since her death, they had been living in hell, and now this hell would continue. The residents of Queensville were also dissatisfied with the court's decision. They believed Paul was the killer and didn't want him living near them. When the man returned home, threatening letters began appearing in their mailbox, and people even started throwing various objects at their house. Meanwhile, the prosecution was working on the appeal. They latched onto the fact that in the first trial, the judge hadn't provided the jury with a clear explanation of the concept of reasonable doubt, and this was enough for a higher court to order a new trial. It began in '91, several years after the murder. During the preparation for it, several interesting facts came to light. It turned out that the expert who had established the match between the fabric particles from Paul's car and the victim's sweater had conducted the examination while wearing a sweater of the same color and material. But when the time came for the second trial, most of the materials about her research had simply disappeared, including the fabric particles and several hairs found on the body or victim's clothing. Several of Christine's bones and a cigarette butt found near her body had also disappeared. It turned out that this evidence hadn't initially been added to the case materials. Perhaps the reason was that Paul had never smoked. Despite all this, the man faced a new trial. This time, the prosecution's main theory was that Paul had seen the tape recorder in Christine's hands, then took out his musical instrument and started playing. The girl heard the music and came to his car on her own. Then Paul forced her to get inside, drove her to an unknown location, and killed her. Despite the fact that this theory was, frankly speaking, weak, in July 1992, the jury came to a unanimous decision. They found Paul guilty of murder, and the man received a life sentence. However, after the end of the second trial, public attitude toward this case changed in the opposite direction. If the first time the media had portrayed Paul as a strange and dangerous loner, Now, after information about all the investigators' mistakes came to light, they changed their rhetoric and began discussing the possibility that Paul might be innocent and was a victim of obvious unprofessionalism. Against this backdrop, a group of concerned citizens united with the goal of challenging the court's decision. In light of this pressure, Paul's lawyer filed an appeal, and after it was accepted, the man was decided to be released on bail. This happened quite rarely, but the wide public resonance allowed Paul to return home. However, there were complications here. The bail amount was about $500,000, so his parents had to mortgage their house to gather such a huge sum. Paul's lawyer requested DNA testing of the victim's underwear, on which biological material had been found. They had tried to study it before, but at that time the examination tools were quite primitive, and experts couldn't extract a genetic profile. Now in the mid-90s, they had more capabilities, so experts conducted the analysis again and were able to obtain a DNA profile from the semen with tissues. The results showed that it definitively did not match Paul's DNA. This news caused a storm of outrage in Canadian society. The man had spent a total of 1.5 years behind bars, several more years participating in court hearings, and his life had essentially been ruined. And all this was directly caused by the actions of police officers who tried not to find evidence, but to fit the existing evidence to Paul's guilt. In January '95, 10 years after Christine's body was discovered, all charges against the man were finally dropped, and he became a free person. Later, he won $1.2 million in a lawsuit against the authorities, and some investigation participants who had fabricated information and evidence against him became subjects of cases themselves. Moreover, this case led to some of the most serious changes in the history of Canada's legal system, aimed at never allowing something like this to happen again. After Paul's release, it was decided to reopen the investigation into Christine's murder, and a new team of detectives was created for this purpose. Now, with a DNA sample from the real perpetrator in hand, they focused on collecting genetic samples from everyone who theoretically could have committed this murder, and in total, they obtained DNA from several hundred men, but they all proved uninvolved. Since then, there has been practically no movement in this case. It was transferred to the Unsolved Murders Division, and in subsequent years was periodically reviewed, but they couldn't find any new suspects. One of the main problems was that the first team of investigators not only lost part of the evidence, but simply didn't conduct a proper investigation in those years. They were convinced that Paul was behind it, so they didn't even consider other people for possible involvement. Canadian media continued to write about this case, and after the publication of one of the major outlets, journalists received several interesting leads. People told them about at least 3 suspects. One man claimed that his father had confessed to killing Christine before his death. Others simply pointed to people with problematic reputations who had lived in Queensville in those years. The journalists passed all this information to the police, but they couldn't link any of them to the murder. In 2019, 35 years after the murder, this case was reopened again, with a new detective assigned to it. Considering that his only lead was the perpetrator's DNA sample, he decided to try to find him using genetic genealogy. There wasn't a single company in Canada that dealt with such complex and innovative work, so the detective had to arrange with a company from the United States and with his superiors to allocate funds for this. Eventually, he got approval, and experts began searching for the perpetrator's relatives through publicly available DNA databases. They managed to find several people who were distantly related to the sample's owner, but studying their genealogy could take years. Then the experts compared information about these distant relatives, which allowed them to narrow down the search somewhat. Ultimately, they concluded that the police needed to study a genealogy of about 400 people to find the sample's owner. Upon receiving this information, he turned to his colleague from Canada, who had vast experience working with DNA. The colleague agreed to help with the investigation and began reconstructing these people's family trees with his team. At the same time, he decided not to share any information with the detective himself, so that he wouldn't build theories and accidentally mislead himself while thinking about anyone's possible involvement. His colleague specialists worked on this task for 8 months, methodically studying various family trees until they focused on just one. Its founder was a man born in 1804, and the experts carefully studied hundreds of his descendants. In October 2020, they zeroed in on one specific family and arrived at a single name of the most likely killer, matching all criteria: Calvin Hoover. When they reported this to the detective, he didn't recognize this person. Hoover hadn't appeared in any case materials or in the thousands of leads received over 3 decades. When he began investigating this person, the detective was in for an extremely unexpected surprise. It turned out that Hoover was one of Christine's family's closest friends. At the time of the murder, he was 28 and lived in Queensville with his wife and children. The girl's parents had been friends with his family for a long time, and Hoover was even listed as their emergency contact. Moreover, just a few days before the incident, Christine's mom had visited them. At that time, she told Hoover's wife that she was going to visit her husband in prison with her son after the dentist appointment, but wouldn't take her daughter since she was still too young to visit such a place. Thus, Hoover's wife knew that the girl would be home alone on a specific day at a specific time, and the man himself, who was also at home, could have heard this. Additionally, Christine knew Hoover well and could have gone with him or gotten into his car without any doubts, as he was a friend of her parents. Next, the detective wondered why Hoover's name didn't appear in the case materials if he was so close to the family. Here he discovered another interesting fact. It turned out that in those years, the police had talked to his wife, who said that at the time of Christine's disappearance, she wasn't home, but she added that her husband was at home, looking after their young children. After this, the police didn't interview the man himself. Apparently, they were satisfied with his wife's words and took them as an alibi. Thus, it turned out that Hoover had the opportunity to commit this crime, and the detective only needed to confirm his guilt. But there was a problem. Hoover had taken his own life in 2015 due to severe health problems. The detective, who needed a direct DNA sample from him, began thinking about what to do. Such death cases weren't always investigated, and even if the body had been examined, no biological samples might have remained after 5 years. However, he got lucky when he contacted the medical examiners who had examined Hoover's body. They said that they actually still had 2 vials of his blood in storage. These were sent to the laboratory, and experts extracted a DNA sample from the blood, comparing it with the killer's profile. They got a complete match. Hoover turned out to be the killer. Christine's parents were shocked by this news, as in all these years, they couldn't even imagine that he would turn out to be the killer. They were also distressed that he had lived his life with his family and children, never facing punishment for what he had done. His relatives were also shocked when police informed them about what Hoover had done. His wife said she never had even a thought that her husband might have been involved in Christine's disappearance. Paul told journalists that finding the real killer didn't change anything for him. He had spent about 10 years between prison and courts, but even after all charges were dropped, many people continued to consider him the killer. He added that all the subsequent years he had lived in constant fear, which hasn't left him to this day, so this case had destroyed not only Christine's life, but his own as well. Thank you for watching this video, and please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I look forward to your comments on this situation. That was Detective STARBORN. See you soon.